Middle school was the dark ages of my life. I was bullied, piled on top of teasing from my family. It kind of resulted in a depression in a culture that doesn't really identify mental health as a concept, or at least at the time they didn't. And in middle school, I didn't do much. I played video games, I would do my schoolwork, and I had just gotten into anime. But the worst part, I have no idea why I looked so sad during that. I'm fine. Everything's great and fine. I probably looked that sad because it took me 40 effing minutes to successfully record that stupid effing intro. Everything's good. Don't know why the intro is so effing sad. All right, video's not that depressing. It's not a sad story. Back to it. My bad. Whoops. Of all of it, I think was a feeling that I couldn't shake. I was lonely. I felt separate. I felt different. I felt like I was always on the moon. Even after middle school, going into high school, when I put in a lot of effort from my side to talk to people, to get to know people, and I think I did pretty well. I met some fantastic people, some I still talk to now in college, and everyone knew me. It was great. But to borrow from BoJack Horseman, everyone loves you, but no one likes you. A lot of great relationships, but they were all pretty loose and superficial, more or less. Then I kept feeling it, even with all of those people, even with surrounded by so many people. I still felt like an observer. I felt like I was just here to bear witness to the events of the world and the things around me. That's all. And for a while in my life, I was unable to recognize or put a word explaining how I felt or what was going on, explaining the feelings and the sensations, the feelings of emptiness, the voice in my head that would always whisper, "You don't belong here." Until one day, I finally got it. It was loneliness. So here in this video, let's dissect this painful feeling that myself and many others have or are going through. Loneliness. You probably know what loneliness is, regardless of what you have or haven't been through in life, regardless of how many people you do or don't talk to. You've probably experienced some semblance of loneliness at some point. But, and the introverts can probably agree with me here, there's a difference between loneliness and, well, being alone. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. In a paper titled Loneliness, Social Isolation, and Cardiovascular Disease, the authors Ningxi and Huizhi Li define loneliness as, quote, the discrepancy between a person's desired and actual social relationships, end quote. While solitude can be defined as a person's physical and digital isolation from other people. And usually we go through a lot of research and papers here and there, but the research on loneliness is mostly what we'll be covering today. Mostly because there's just not that much research on the effects of positive solitude, is what we would call it. The idea of going to a mountain by yourself, right? We just haven't looked at that. And hopefully in the coming years, it's a growing field and we'll look at that more. But for loneliness is mostly what we focus on. And even for loneliness, a lot of the research is on elderly people, but a lot of these papers say that they control for age, meaning that the conclusions shouldn't have to do with how old the subjects are. And there will be papers mentioned where it's on, different age subjects in a wide array and hopefully covering your range as well. Usually I hold off on you, but for this one, we're gonna go right into it. People that are more lonely are at higher risk for a metabolic disease, cardiovascular problems, diabetes, arthritis, and also higher mortality by about 14 to 20%, which is twice as bad as obesity. One paper even suggested that people who are more lonely had a 45% lower chance of survival than people who are less lonely, who had a 50% higher chance of survival. What that means, you can read the paper. Again, as usual, all of the sources are in the description. It'll be in a Notion page, and so you can find the links in that Notion page. What we also see is psychological problems as well. So we can see increased inflammation, and we can also see increased activity in the part of the brain that controls physiological stress and inflammation. The HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, it's where your hypothalamus, your pituitary glands, and your adrenal glands, come together, where they axis. And so with that, we see an increased prognostic for depression, anxiety, psychological stress, cognitive deterioration, and even in higher progression or quicker progression of Alzheimer's disease. And so if you watched my sleep deprivation video, you might be thinking, this sounds a lot like the effects of sleep deprivation. And you'd be right, it does. And so maybe you think, is he making all of this up? All of these symptoms? No, I'm not that desperate. At least not yet. But what we can see, if we look at that sleep deprivation video, I think I mentioned it there. If you haven't watched that, I recommend that you go watch that after this one. If you want to learn more about the other things that might happen to you, I covered a lot more there. In one of the studies that I think I mentioned in the video, if not, it was in the source material for the video, done by Matthew Walker, we saw that there's a bi-directional relationship between sleep deprivation and Alzheimer's disease. Well, not Alzheimer's disease, sleep deprivation and loneliness. And so what that means is that people who were more lonely had worse sleep, and people who had worse sleep, so less sleep or a lower quality of sleep, were more lonely. They actually had higher activation in the near space network of the brain, meaning basically they felt a lot more threatened when people came close to them than you normally would if you were less sleep deprived. And so that's why a lot of these are similar, and a lot of the effects that we see in sleep deprivation, we're also going to see in loneliness. So, yeah, very fun. Again, if you haven't watched that video, go give that one a watch. One thing that we can ask is, why is loneliness such a big issue? And you've probably heard this before, and if you haven't, you're definitely going to hear it again. Human beings are social creatures. Back when we were playing with sticks, living in caves, and hunting with our bare hands, which I guess is the premise of Minecraft, you were much more likely to survive as long as you were in a group. Basically, much more likely. If you didn't have a group, if you weren't with other people, you would die. So your brain made loneliness a pretty bad option so that you wouldn't choose loneliness. And we can actually see this in things like groupthink and other psychological effects that involve conforming yourself and or your opinions to other people in order to be a part of a group. Loneliness is something we're just not evolved to deal with, and your brain makes it pretty clear that it's pretty good to be with other people. So we see that psychologically, for instance, people with more social relationships, overall, they just report higher life satisfaction. They're just more okay with their life. And then we also see that people that have more social relationships have better immune systems. And this makes sense, right? The more people that you interact with, maybe it's a bit gross, but the more germs that you're exposed to, and the more your immune system can learn from that. And we actually know that in people who have lower social relationships, or people that interact with less people, have a less diverse gut microbiome, which is a plethora of its own talking points and has a bunch of its own thing. It's actually pretty cool. Your brain is basically a gut. I actually made a podcast episode on that, so I'll link that below, maybe, if I remember, if you want to go ahead and watch that one. This is the second point that we're ending with a self-plug, and I have no shame whatsoever. Loneliness has been on the rise for the past few years. Yeah, and that may be due just to sheer social isolation and quarantine. Like we said at the top of the video, some people, loneliness is defined as the difference between your desired and your real reality social interaction. So if quarantine is not your desired amount of social interaction, you're gonna feel lonely. And let me put my boomer hat on. Technology might also play a part in this rise in loneliness, because it did start before quarantine. And the reason, so technology can be amazing. It can let you interact with people that you've never met. I myself have internet friends whom I love and that I interact with that technology lets me interact with on a daily, if not weekly basis. There are probably, though, a non-zero amount of people that only want to show a perfect life on social media, and then they feel lonely because they're trying to, act that in real life, and that's probably because they're living a lie. And hopefully you grow out of this in high school or at the very most college, but I'm sure that somewhere there are people who are living a lie all the time. But loneliness sucks, and from the beginning of the video, trust me, I know. So how can we be less lonely? Well, let's start with saying that loneliness perpetuates itself. We actually know that people who are more lonely are more likely to reject. I don't know whether to say more likely to reject or less likely to accept social invitations. So the first step in being less lonely is to stop being lonely. Now that we've gotten that covered, I'll give you some less researchy advice and then we'll go back to it. And first, let's start with solitude. Solitude is pretty solid. We've seen some great things across all ages, even some productivity benefits. Solitude, spending time by yourself, taking some time to think, or even playing video games by yourself might be enough, but being by yourself shouldn't be an horrific experience. It should be pretty okay. And I would recommend that the first thing you do is be okay with being by yourself, with being alone. Although this may not fix the fact or change the fact that you have no friends, it will help ease the pain, if not completely take away from the pain, that you have no friends. Now, making friends. That's definitely an important part of the puzzle, for sure. And so for making friends, what we can say is that if you're lonely, you're actually better at reading facial expressions of other people. You do, however, become worse at interpreting those expressions. For example, you might be really great at recognizing that someone's tired, but instead of thinking that they're tired, you'll think, this person doesn't want to talk to me, they want me to go away forever and jump in a black hole, which when you run away in a few seconds, they might think that, but for now, they're just tired, and you have a hard time recognizing that. And from what I've seen and read and heard, mostly it seems like loneliness comes from anxiety, not loneliness itself, but the ability to make friends comes from anxiety. Anxiety prevents you from tying that friendship knot. You see, you go into a social interaction and you have this great ability to read facial expressions and understand how people are feeling and how they're interpreting, or not how they're interpreting things, because you get bad at that, but seeing how they're reacting to things. However, you become much worse at understanding that, and then you also get tripped up. You feel anxious, and then you choke, like me in Apex Legends. And so one of the things that we can do to fix our ability to interact socially is work on anxiety. And we can do that through therapy, meditation, better sleep, a number of things. I would recommend therapy, meditation, and better sleep definitely on, those will be my top 3 recommendations, and the therapist will probably give you the other ones: better diet, exercise, etc. Work on that anxiety. And also, lastly, make sure that you have people that you can talk to. And for most people, this may sound easy enough, right? If you're in school, you talk to your classmates. If you have a job, you talk to your coworkers. But if that's not your crowd, which is completely fine, no malice involved, you don't have to, sometimes people just don't tickle your pickle. In that case, maybe find a club somewhere locally that, it fits your interests and, may have people that are similar to you and that you would enjoy interacting to, because it's hard to make friends if there's no one around, right? Social isolation definitely is an impediment to friendship. Digitally, again, I guess you could meet people online, but real friends are cool. So I would recommend that. So with that, be okay with being by yourself. Work on anxiety. Work on interpretation of facial expressions. It's probably, most people don't care enough to hate you right when they meet you. Okay, so if you're interpreting that someone doesn't like you, it's probably not the case. They probably don't like something else, or they're tired, or they're busy, or they're in a rush. All right. And lastly, talk to people. That's probably going to be your best shot. If you talk to enough people, one of them's probably going to like you. And if none of them do, maybe you should spend some time in solitude and look inwards. That does help. And so that's the advice that I would give for helping or with social interactions and making friends. How did I stop feeling lonely? Well, that's quite the assumption to make, isn't it? Luckily, though, it is the correct assumption. For me, personally, this is a bit unscientific, so if you don't want to listen to it, sure. But for me, it was the realization that we're all connected, that we're all part of this divine oneness. And for some people, that may be saying there's a piece of God in everyone. And if that's how you roll, if the religion is what you're into, then that's a great and fine interpretation. It works. But outside of religion, it's the realization that there's not much difference in the existence of yourself and a blade of grass. There might be a big difference in the way that you're biologically composed, but there's not much of a difference between your essence, the essence of you and the essence of that grass. You're, at the end of the day, all a part of this big one piece of, maybe to some people, divinity, and to other people, just a sea of oneness. And for me, that's what helped me, just regardless of where I was or who I was with, that understanding that I'm merely a piece of this massive ocean, merely a drop in the massive ocean. And that's all pretty hippy dippy. And if you don't want that, that's, fine, right? It worked for me, so it worked for me. It might not work for you. But that's going to be all for this video. Thank you so much for watching this one. I will see you in the next one. Much love. Talk to people. Peace.